Hi, welcome to our channel at Mundelein Church in the Nazarene and our series on Not What You Think. We have been looking at kind of distinctive Christian thinking in the last weeks in a way you might not be familiar with. Because sometimes the popular theology that is out there is not really matching what a lot of Christianity actually believes. Now we're taking a little bit of break from that, and we're going to do a special Christmas Not What You Think today. And we're going to go over the Christmas story, but maybe in a way you haven't heard that often before. It's a story that has been told again and again, but I don't think we examine it often in its historical context. And Scripture has quite a lot to say about the arrival of God into our world, and there's quite a few different Christmas passages. The first one, chronologically, was not written by the author of Luke or Matthew, but was written by Paul in his letter to the Philippians, when he writes, Jesus, though he was God, did not cling to his rights, did not cling to what he was expected to have as God, and laid that all aside. Laid aside his mighty power and glory, and became obedient, became one of us, even unto death. So that's really the first reference to what Jesus did. We also have the Gospel of John. That's after Matthew and Luke, but the Gospel of John says it in a different way. It speaks of God as this principle, this purest thought, this mind of God, this agent of change, an agent of wisdom in the world. But it's called the Logos. Jesus, in the beginning, was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And later in John chapter 1, the glory of God was not in any miracle that he did, was not in any of his great power. The glory of God was that he made his dwelling among us. He became flesh. The Word became flesh and lived among us. So it really at Christmas we don't celebrate a child or a baby, though we do. We celebrate the arrival of God into flesh. He became one of us and walked among us. But now let's get back to the Christmas story. There's a lot that's there. We have this girl named Mary who was pledged to be married to a man named Joseph. We don't know much about her, but anyway, she became pregnant, but she was a virgin. That's an odd thing to happen. Joseph finds out about it. He's not happy. In that time, if a girl who is pledged to be married, so when you were married, so you would have been, there would have been an agreement between the two families, Joseph's family and Mary's family. There would have probably been a monetary arrangement, and because of that, Mary was pledged to be married to Joseph. She was obligated, though the marriage hadn't taken place. The expectation is that the groom would go and, in the terms of that day, would go to prepare a place for her. That often meant they would add on to the family home, maybe on top of it or behind it. And when that place was done, the groom would come back with all his family, with all his friends, and there would be a marvelous wedding celebration. We see a little bit of that later in Matthew, the parable of the 10 bridesmaids who are waiting for the bridegroom to appear. That's what we're seeing. The wedding party is waiting, not knowing exactly when the groom is going to show up, not knowing exactly what day that place would have been prepared. And so, in that interim time, Mary shows up pregnant. Now, that would have been a shock. It would have been expected at the time for Joseph to shame her, publicly bring her to disgrace. For how dare she commit adultery before she was even married? The text tells us that Joseph had decided to do it privately, to not expose her to shame. Joseph was a person who was not seeking to expose her to public ridicule. And in that time, we have a conversation that Joseph had with God, and he becomes aware that this is special, and so he keeps Mary. And we have all this. We have this scene of a trek to Bethlehem to take a census. not being any room. And so there was these desperate situations, and Mary gives birth, and Jesus comes into our world in a very humble circumstance. Now here's what we do. We take this to the other extreme, and in our world we talk about Jesus was born into the depths of poverty and riddled with hardship, and Mary and Joseph were poor, homeless parents just seeking refugees, wandering around, and all of these stories do not much more than just reflect the political opinions of the person doing the talking. Well, Joseph was a carpenter. Just a few miles away was a town called Sepphoris, and that was a capital city that Herod was building. Joseph would have been able to get up in the morning, walk downhill for 3 miles. Wouldn't have taken him an hour to get there. He could have worked, walked back uphill to Nazareth at the end of the day. Let's tell a little bit about that story. With the names Mary and Joseph, we know a lot about this couple, and you wouldn't think so. Most names of Jewish people in the first century were starting to reflect their Greco-Roman situation. Look at the rest of the people we get to in the New Testament. Look at the names: Cephas, Bartholomew, Nathaniel, Philip, Andrew. They're all Greek. They're all Roman. But there was this small sect of Jews that were highly devout and highly conservative. We have some evidence that this group of people were centered largely around the area around Nazareth. And they named their children after the patriarchs, those great stories from Genesis and Exodus. So instead of naming their children Cephas or Johannes or Bartholomew or Nathaniel, they would have named their children, I don't know, Isaac or Joseph. And if it was a girl, you'd have named her Miriam, or the Greek form of that, Mary. We already can locate Mary and Joseph as part of this very devout, religious family. In all likelihood, there was also a certain group of Pharisees that were centered around Nazareth. They were far more conservative and devout and strict than the ones down the hill in Capernaum that followed Rabbi Hillel. These were expecting the Messiah and looking forward to it. So Joseph was probably, I'm connecting the dots, a Pharisee. And he probably took his faith very seriously. And when he married Mary, in spite of her pregnancy, not only did that help shield her from a public shaming, it probably destroyed the leadership political career of Joseph. He'd never be a leader of the Pharisees. So he struggled. He was a carpenter in obscurity, raising his family. A carpenter walking down the road to Sepphoris would have earned a decent living. Let's not import categories and say they're part of a middle class. That didn't exist. But they certainly weren't in the lowest classes. They weren't the day laborers, the shepherds, the people who existed at the margins. He would have earned enough to have a decent life for he and his young wife. And you've also had enough to provide Jesus, his oldest son, some specialized Jewish schooling. At the synagogue, they would have found many teachers. Jesus, in all likelihood, was raised in a Pharisee's home, and Jesus was trained to be a Pharisee himself. Now, if we look ahead, there are hints of this all through the Gospels. Jesus runs into the Jewish leaders. There's a dispute, and the leaders go, "Hey, aren't you the carpenter's son?" They've met him before. Not, "Aren't you Jesus, the guy we've heard about, the guy that does miracles?" "Hey, aren't you the carpenter's son?" In John, when he runs into the Jewish leaders, they say, "Wait a minute, who do you think you are? We're not illegitimate." That's a little pointed barb at Jesus. We know your story. We know where you came from. We know the story of your mother. So Jesus was not born in this ravages of poverty. He was born in a very conservative, very devout, very religious home. In short, in very average first century Jewish circumstances. Then Jesus is later kicked out of his hometown of Nazareth. If he was just a poverty-ridden, homeless wanderer, there would have been no reason to kick him out. He didn't have enough following. But if you're from a family that has a little bit of stature, what you say can be damaging, so you might be evicted from Nazareth. So Mary and Joseph give birth, not a poor family, but just an average family. Into this average family is born the King of the Jews. If you go to the Gospel of Matthew, you find later, it doesn't really tell us later, probably some months later, maybe even a year or two later, the three wise men, the Magi, they don't go to the stable and find Jesus, they go to the home. Joseph and Mary are back home. Again, not in the poverty-stricken stable, but an average home in an average small town in an average place like Galilee. That's really the story of Christmas. It's not to be pulled apart and swayed by ancient political context or ruined by modern political context. It was just, he was average in every way, and God, when he came into our world, decided to come into the average, to come into the routine, to come into the humdrum existence of life. So this Christmas, I don't know where this Christmas finds you. Maybe this is one of your best Christmases in years. If it is, man, that's fantastic. And maybe this is a Christmas where you're struggling, and I'm sorry if that's the case. But I imagine for most of us, we're somewhere in between. It's a Christmas that looks a lot like last year and the year before that. We've bought our gifts, sent out our cards, tried to hit everybody on our list, wish some things in life were going better, thankful that other parts of life aren't going worse, but we find ourselves trying to just get through this day-to-day existence. Well, Jesus did too. That's who he was. And that's the world he came in. Average, just like ours. What I want to do is just give you a little context about the kind of home, the fact that Jesus was probably raised to be a Pharisee. And let's not let the current political debates and context really wreck what is the story that the Gospels try to present. We celebrate this week because God became flesh. We should still celebrate because his Spirit still walks around, still exists within us. That's the wonderful story of this Christmas and any Christmas. Anyway, glad you joined us. After Christmas, we'll get back onto our Not What You Believe and start tackling some more doctrinal concerns like we have been in the past few weeks, like predestination and universalism. But glad you joined us. We'll see you back here next week. We'll see you then.